All right, thank you, everyone. I feel like a rock star. That was great. Yeah, really nice to be here with all of you today. Thank you to Abby, to Robbie, to the whole team at SAFE for putting on a fantastic event. And this panel session, we're really going to be looking at, we've heard a lot about the upstream, the downstream sort of sides of this supply chain, but I think what often gets overlooked is sort of bridging that gap between when you're taking the materials out of the ground and how they're actually becoming these advanced materials that can be used in all of these strategic applications. So we have an expert panel with us today who are going to explore all of those topics and a lot more with me. So without further ado, I would like to, first of all, welcome the Honourable Scott Moe, who's Premier of Saskatchewan, to the stage.
Good to see you.
Excellent. Next, we have Ms. Tina Armstrong, who's Managing Director of Base Metals at Hatch. Next up, we have Stacey Hasty, who's the CEO of US Strategic Metals.
Okay.
And last but not least, before the music goes, we have RJ Kocher, who is CEO of Li-Cycle. Okay, so to kick things off, everyone, well, actually, before I kick things off into questions, maybe if each of you could give just a brief introduction to you, your position, and sort of why you're here today, why you're interested in this subject.
I'm Scott Moe. I'm the Premier of a subnational government, the province of Saskatchewan. It's a province just north of North Dakota and Montana in the what we call the prairie provinces of Canada. And what we do in Saskatchewan is we provide the North America and the world with food, fuel, and fertilizer. We're an agrarian province by historical nature, but we also have a vibrant mining industry. We're the second largest oil producer in the nation of Canada. And why we're here today is we have developed over the last half a century or 70 years what is the largest potash mining industry in the world. We have developed a uranium mining industry, and that is providing the world with between 10 and 20% of our global uranium needs. We're stepping now into helium production, we're stepping into lithium production, and now we're stepping into the processing area of specifically the rare earth elements through a government arm's length organization called our Saskatchewan Research Council, which is there to support the entirety of the mining industry in Saskatchewan. And so that's a little bit about our province and a little bit about why I think I'm here participating and Saskatchewan is here participating in this SAFE Summit. And thank you to Robbie and all the folks for organizing it.
Yeah. Tina.
Thanks. So yes, I'm the Managing Director of Base Metals at Hatch. So Hatch is a global professional services firm. We focus on engineering and construction management. And over our 65-year history, the majority of our work has been in the metals business. My personal background is process engineering and pyrometallurgy. And right now I look after nickel, copper, cobalt, platinum group metals, uranium, gold. And I think I'm here because finally what I do is cool.
Stacey Hasty, CEO for US Strategic Metals, also the co-founder, here today to be able to announce that we will be the first commercial company that will be processing battery-grade metals in the United States. Will be this fall, so we're pretty excited about that and excited to share that story with everyone here, government officials and also end users and everybody else in the space.
Thanks, Andy. Ajay Kochar. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Li-Cycle. So we're a lithium-ion battery recycling company. And we run a two-phase model where we take in batteries, we break them down. It's a spoke and hub model. We've arranged those facilities around the US today between New York, Arizona, Alabama. And then a second step where we refine that back into battery-grade materials, what I call the building blocks of lithium-ion batteries again. So we'll be online in the next while. We'll be projected to be one of the largest sources of lithium domestically in the US from recycling. Today, the US has about 6,000 tons of lithium production, lithium carbonate production in the US. So very excited to be here. Also used to work at Hatch in the lithium industry. So good to be an engineer up here with my fellow panelists.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, guys. So to kick things off, I wanted to ask each of you a little bit about what you see as the wider ecosystem that's going to be required to really support this type of processing that takes place. I think a lot of people from a mining background often think about, taking things out of the ground. How do you extract them? How do you ship them? How do you get them around the world? I think when you talk about these more strategic markets or emerging clean energy industries, what the big differentiator is bridging the gap between that mining and fitting in chemical processing and refining for the applications they're going into. What's the wider ecosystem that you need to sort of support that type of development?
Well, you want me to go
Please,
first? Yeah, I would say understanding that everyone has a role to play, and we often think of private industry playing the roles that they do, whether it be in mining, whether it be in processing. And one of the largest challenges specific to the rare earths, I think, is the economics of it all right now, and it just isn't quite there, but we all know it's going to get there, and it's just a matter of time of how quickly we do get there, and then you're going to see ultimately the capital come into that space and come into that space very quickly. But how do we do those, everyone has a role to play in developing us actually getting there, which is what this summit is about, is not so much about the why, as Robbie said, but the how. And that's what we're discussing here. And so private industry has a role in that. The governments have a role in that. We've seen the national government in the United States come out with the IRA Act, which I think is going to move the needle substantially. In Canada, our federal government is delivering their budget later today. I think you're going to see likely substantial investment as well that's going to complement what has already been moved on in the United States. We as a subnational government also have a role to play. We had a role to play in developing the potash mining industry, the uranium mining industry. We have a role to play, and we just released our critical mineral strategy provincially this past Monday, yesterday I suppose, in developing that mining industry, but also developing that processing industry as well. And what I would say is we should be doing this where we're already doing similar things in the world. We in Saskatchewan don't manufacture batteries, for example, but we do mining, and we do that rudimentary processing. We're fortunate to have innovation in the private sector, companies like Hatch that are operating already in the potash mining industry, the uranium mining industry, and that crosses over very well to do those things that we're already doing well in other industries, do them well in this industry. And so I would say stick to your knitting, right? If you're already building vehicles and batteries and those types of things, that's where you should do that. And where you have the resource, and the resource is not just the mineral resource, it's the people, you should do that in that area of the world as well.
Yeah, maybe for Tina, we've discussed this a little bit, but I think people is a really important part of this equation that often gets overlooked. You're bound by geology, of course. We can't control that, but hopefully I think what we need to put in the foundations for is to have that workforce and those skills available when these industries are ramping up.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to recognize these are complex plants. The feeds are not uniform. So there's a high degree of complexity, and you need that subject matter expertise, you need that background, you need that history to bring from analogous industries into something new. And people, I think globally, we're seeing people, be it engineering, be it operations, be it skilled trades, be it in fabrication, in vendors, all of this is going to be one of the bottlenecks. So we have to make this industry attractive and retain those people, bring them into this industry, and build on that, because I think that could be one of our biggest bottlenecks.
Yeah. Stacey, I don't know if you have a follow-up in terms of, I think about the materials that your company focuses on, and understood it from a more traditional industrial application side of things, but when you talk about refining those for the battery industry, there's not many people out there who've done that historically, particularly outside of China, outside of Asia. How do you find that as you're looking to scale and planning to scale? How do you bridge that gap in sort of expertise?
Well, first of all, we had to bring the expertise, quite frankly, from out of the U.S. We immediately, when we decided we realized we had a significant resource and capabilities in our Missouri facility, in our Missouri mine. We decided that we needed to do an international search for people that were qualified. We ended up hiring two of the top people from Congo, from the Matunda mine at Glencore, and they came, and it's all about the team. I think I'm going to go with what Tina started with. It's all about the team. So we're fortunate enough to do a lot of due diligence on possible hydrometallurgical technologies. Ended up picking a technology that was not well known, a one-man shop, but our team was able to take that concept and also enhance it, make it applicable to what we're trying to do. And it ended up that this technology could not only process but it could also process black mass, such as what Li-Cycle produces. We're not a black mass producer, we're a black mass processor. So at the end of the day, it's all about the team and you know, obviously the three keys to success that I always say. It all comes down to the following. You have to have the feedstock. You got to have a technology that is effective and environmentally friendly, and you have to have the permits. Those are the three keys to success, not to mention a lot of other things, which I'll hold off to later questions that I'm sure is going to come up.
Excellent. And maybe on point 2 there, I think, you know, technology is something I really want to spend a bit of time on. I know each of you have some thoughts, but RJ, you are developing what is, to all intents and purposes, a sort of a new technology to the industry, really. It's looking further into the future of what this lithium-ion battery market is going to require. Talk us through a bit of the opportunity as you see it, because you know, people often talk about catching up China or catching up other parts of the world. Certainly from Benchmark's perspective, we see some of these new innovations, new parts of the supply chain, new technologies being deployed as a massive opportunity for parts of the world, like the US, Canada, whereby they can actually be leaders in this space rather than following what might have been done or trying to replicate what might be done today. How do you sort of see that and the understanding of that?
Yeah, so building on the thread of what Tina was talking about around analogous industries. So my background is actually in mining and metallurgy. What's unique about this as you bring together all these different stakeholders is, we were talking about this backstage, you have manufacturing, which is a lot of our customers, and then you have metallurgy. And metallurgy is really different. It's, as Tina put it, it can be variable. It takes potentially a long time to ramp up. The equipment can take a long time to buy. I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But vis-a-vis, what can this do for us as an advantage? Just to give you a bit of an example of our Rochester project. So I mentioned two-phase model. We call our hub where we take that black mass in and we're going to refine it and make battery-grade materials. So back in mining speak, you talk in order of decades, usually. If you think about from the moment of exploration all the way through to production. We announced we were going to go to Rochester with this project probably about 3-4 years ago now. We have our permits. We're working with different customers. We feed to those points. But just at the bigger level, it's the time of development to get to product. And the question here is, what can we do? You know, obviously, around the IRA, it's a cross-supply chain focus, but where are the specific areas where we can have some wins? And from my perspective, recycling is one of those. And even if you have that first baseload material from scrap, from the making of batteries, so production rejects, we don't want to lose that, right? That was bought as lithium, nickel, cobalt, whatever it may be, into a battery at one point. None of our customers want to lose that. So once it's here domestically, and broadly, say from a friend-shoring perspective as well, we don't want to lose it. And I think that's one of the advantages that recycling can bring. It's not the only part of the solution. We need mining. You know, I'm an engineer, so physics, you can't just scrape material out of nowhere. But it's part of the solution. And I think it's an example of where we can step out and have an advantage sooner.
Prema, I know we talked a little bit, and you have some examples in Saskatchewan of where you've sort of looked to do things, you know, rather than replicating what's done previously. You've used that network of skills and expertise from various industries in your region to really push forward and maybe displace some of that dependence on other parts of the world.
Right, we have, as I said, a large potash mining industry in Saskatchewan. We had a new potash mine that was just completed and came into production. We have the largest potash mine in the world. It's currently under construction in the province. We have a uranium mine being looked at, finding its way through the regulatory process. And it's important, just to back up to the last question, around, and maybe a little bit of a different perspective as a subnational premier, is that regulatory certainty is imperative. We need the people, you need the mineral resource, but you also need that regulatory certainty. The innovation and technology then can come from the people that are already working in that sector. And so this is why I say you should stick to your knitting, really. And in Saskatchewan, we do mining and we do those first steps of processing in the potash industry. We do the same in the uranium industry. We have hundreds of companies like Hatch that are operating in and around those two industries already. And so we have that critical mass of expertise and of people with that expertise that then can loan that expertise to developing the rare earth, not only the mining industry, but also the processing industry. And I would say that in Saskatchewan, with our first steps into the processing project that we have at the Saskatchewan Research Council, where they have produced already a number of metal alloy ingots, and will be in full production here in 2024. If we didn't have that critical mass and that innovation and those people in those other industries, there's not a chance that we would be where we are in finding our way in developing not only the rare earth elements mining industry, the critical minerals mining industry, but that processing facility in particular.
Yeah. And Tina, maybe you can pick that up a little bit in the sense of how transferable are the skills in some of these other critical mineral industries? You know, we are talking about new emerging technologies that quite often, when you're looking at the type of lithium that's going to be required or the type of nickel that's required, it can change from customer to customer, right? It can be very refined. So when you talk about, obviously, the skills in other types of critical minerals is going to be key. But do you think we're ramping up the knowledge base fast enough to sort of meet the massive demand on the horizon?
For sure. Again, there is a lot of applicable things across these a lot of the unit operations, a lot of the chemistries, the learnings of materials of construction, all of that thing, they're very, very transferable, but you still have to do the homework. You still have to do the test work. You still have to do the analysis of what your feedstocks are. You still have to understand what all these recycles are going to mean. So that complexity is still there, but thankfully there is a lot of history that can be learned and can be applied. So we're not starting from scratch by any means with a lot of these. And there's a lot of good people thinking about a lot of these process innovations, how to do things differently, not just to extract new things, but to do it cheaper, to do it more efficiently, and to make the types of products that we're trying to make in the world today, which is somewhat a little bit different from some of the traditional products. The other side of innovation, it's not just about the process or the technology, but it's about how we execute projects. Things like being more digital, trying to be more efficient in the field. I think that's another area that in order to meet this demand, we're going to have to really step up our game in terms of efficiency of delivery in addition to just the technology.
Yeah.
Okay. Andrew, can I add to the
Please.
innovation part? I'll tell you something else that will help the innovation, which we're doing, is streamlining the supply chain. Okay, so when you take a look at the processing, we have the mining and the recycling of the product that we receive. We process that material, and we're permitted, hopefully, in 26, we'll be doing PCAM, precursor. They're building these CAM plants all over the United States. We're centrally located in St. Louis. They got to get their PCAM somewhere, and right now, all it is China. So you're looking at a supply chain right now that is fragmented, very fragmented. The standard one is DRC to China, and the PCAM will end up coming to the US or North America. So that's very fragmented. So if you go ahead and you integrate this in the US or on one site such as ours, this integration creates innovation, because at the very tail end of our hydromet process is crystallization for shipping the sulfates that we would end up shipping for a precursor development. Doing all this all the way to PCAM, we can bypass the crystallization phase and pump directly from solvent extraction straight into the precursor process, which is a huge deal. Plus, you know, what's the whole purpose here? We're trying to reduce the carbon footprint, okay? So DRC to China, China to North America does not do that. So we need to figure out a way that we can integrate, secure that supply chain, not only for innovation, but also for national security.
When you think about that integration, maybe a question for everyone, where do you think the US should be positioned? Where should certain regions, should we be localizing the entire supply chain through to battery car production? We're obviously bound on the upstream side of things by geology to a certain extent, but what is the position for somewhere like Saskatchewan? Obviously a very mining-friendly jurisdiction, a long history, a lot of expertise there. Are you looking to go, to take this continually value add further down the supply chain, or is it more about leveraging your expertise and then partnering with other jurisdictions to do the further downstream side of things?
Well, I would maybe just make a comment on we used to call this global supply chain efficient 5 years ago, and that's what we strive towards. Today, what we're looking for, consequently, or what we're looking for from the Saskatchewan perspective, is how do we develop the North American supply chain? We have developed, and we've been involved in this conversation as a subnational government, some of the greatest food security on earth in North America, without even thinking about it. And that's happened with integration across the 49th parallel to an unprecedented degree. You can look at what we've done in our historical energy security when it comes to oil and uranium and other products that are going back and forth. And I would say that we haven't been as successful in developing that energy security as we have been in the food security space, because of that really, for the most part, unrestricted access back and forth in the whole supply chain of the ag industry. What this conference and this summit is discussing is where are we going in the future when it comes to energy sources, energy supply chains of the future in North America, and creating that energy security tomorrow, most certainly in our North American, or I call it continental energy security, where the conversation has shifted. And so what's Saskatchewan's role in that? I would never discount, as we want to grow and become obviously the center of the world is our goal, but that's down the way. But we do want to grow, and we're a very growth-oriented government. So I would never preclude that we wouldn't get into battery production, into all of the manufacturing space, but we don't do that now. And so if we jumped into that, we would likely, companies would fail in our province. What we do is we do have a certainty in the mining regulations that we have. We do have certainty in those first few steps of the ladder, or the rungs of the ladder in the processing space when it comes to all of these other, many of them critical minerals already, as they've been recently identified, but all of these other products. And so that's what we do. We do it well. We provide certainty for that investment to flow when the economics work. That's where we need to start. And so how high we climb, that'll be for years down the way. There's other areas, I think, in North America that do some of the recycling, for example, some of the battery production, the manufacturing. They already do that and do that well, and I would suggest that we should build off the people, the innovation, and the knowledge that they have for that portion of the supply chain. But most certainly, the conversation has shifted, and I think that's something for us to all recall, or all keep in mind, is 5 years ago, we were focused on a global supply chain. Today, we're focused on a North American supply chain. We have examples to follow and to emulate. I throw forward the food security example in North America. We take it for granted. We should follow that example when it comes to discussing our energy security for the next 3, 5, 10, and 20 years.
Andy, it's a pretty fundamental question, right? And I think the supply chain is tough because it's so fluid.
Right.
And so every part of everything in what Stacey was talking about, even around precursor, for example, we've only seen one precursor plant other than recycling-oriented come to North America, to my knowledge, and that's in Kingston, Ontario, where one of our spokes is, and that's Umicore. And you've seen additional cathode making come. Again, from a virgin perspective, it's primarily in Canada, so from a North American perspective, it's in North America, and there's some that's also associated with recycling as well. But I think it's a pretty fundamental question, and with the recent and potential guidance around IRA, there is an economics question here too, and just to spice it up a bit, I maybe disagree a bit in terms of how we get there. I think in an ideal state, yes, you would have PCAM, you would have CAM, you'd integrate with recycling. This is how it is in China, for example. But how are we going to get there? And if I'm in the shoes of a battery maker, or I'm in the shoes of somebody who makes PCAM, just being blunt, you're dealing with a single-digit business, single-digit margin business. You're dealing with CapEx that's going to be much higher in North America and Europe. So what's the incentive? Right? That's not our business. That's not what we do. But this is what we hear, right? So from the angle of oriented beside recycling, for example, or making the materials, you can get rid of crystallization. You can save CapEx. You can make it much more efficient. I think that's a great medium-term, long-term thing to work towards. But the question is, how do we get there in this rapid pace and hit those EV targets realistically? What's the goal? Is the goal to get more EVs on the road? Is the goal to do it ideally from day one? From my perspective, it has to be both. It has to be a practical path to get there, at the same time while not jeopardizing national security. And I think that's the conversation we need to be having because it's not linear and it's totally fluid.
Maybe let's stick on the point of capital, because I'd love to talk a bit more about capital deployment across this supply chain. We see the money now coming from government. We see the money coming from within the industry. We see public markets responding to what's happening. Are people overlooking the processing step and quite how difficult this is going to be? Because we've seen examples, even in the early stages of the ramp up of the lithium industry, for example, where we've seen massive commitments to establish new processing hubs in Australia and new parts of the world. And because people look at this, and we're guilty of this at Benchmark ourselves, it's sort of saying that on paper you can add a new refinery in 18 months, 3 years, to build it. But what often gets overlooked in that equation is the fact that you have to look at the quality of what's coming out of that and how long it's going to take to ramp that and to partner with that with the feedstock that's going in. And I think one bit that strikes me as often getting overlooked as we come to understand there is this typically decades-long development pathway for mining. People are overlooking that really you need to start that mining or the feedstock to start coming out before you can perfect the refining step. And that's quite likely going to add several more years to the equation. So, is capital going in fast enough? Are we underestimating or overestimating the responsiveness of the processing side of this?
Stacey, you had your
Let me jump in on that. Without a doubt, entry into this space is very costly, very expensive. Long lead items, capital projects, inflation now, supply chain issues. All that does is layer on more difficulties. However, I think the government with the IRA and whatnot has done a good job. It's a good start. The only thing I would say to the government folks here was that, the first round of grant money seemed to be focused more on lithium and what I'd call longer lead projects, instead of projects that can make an immediate impact, such as ours. Yes, we were unsuccessful this time, but we could make an impact and expand within 1 to 2 years with the right amount of funding. Capital markets are tough. The only way we're going to compete with China is, they subsidize that industry. We're going to have to subsidize this industry and get a lot of players in the game. There's room for a lot of people in this space, but the subsidy is going to have to come in, the incentives are going to have to come in to compete with China. And the other thing I want to roll into this is strategic partnerships. That's the other way we're going to succeed. We have strategic partners on our feedstock. We have, Intercoal, who's one of the top black mass producers right now in the U.S. as well, along with you guys.
There's that Stacey room for all of us. So.
Yeah, there's room for all of us. And, we have some other third-party concentrate folks that strategics with. We're right now talking to strategics on the tail end, the end user. And let's face it, that's the OEMs and that's the battery manufacturers. So, but here's my message to these folks. Participate from an equity standpoint, participate maybe from a prepayment, participate with a solid offtake that's financeable. That will help. But don't sit here and look at us and say, hey, we want a discount for all of that. Recognize the value of paying market for access to the metals and a secure domestic North American supply chain. There's big value to that. Just don't be at the mercy of China.
Building off what Stacey said, I think it is heavily underestimated how complicated it is to bring up refining. We're dealing with very tight specifications when you make those chemicals. They change all the time, right? They get tighter and tighter and tighter. So you have to think ahead, even when you design these facilities, what might that be, right? It could be iron level in nickel sulfate, I'm getting pretty specific here. But taking a step back, I think we have to modulate our understanding of what is that path to electrification when you factor all these things in. We've been fortunate. Our Rochester Hub facilities are going to benefit from a loan from the Department of Energy through the ATVM program, Loan Programs Office. We're very fortunate for that. But to be frank, and I know Jigger well, and he's been a great supporter with their team there. To Stacey's point, we had to have other partners along the way. That can't be also the only capital source that you have, right? It's a great force accelerator, a great added amount of support. And I think finally it's great to see the government stepping in with supporting companies in the way that we've seen China do in many ways, but we have to move quickly. And I think there is a big underestimation of how long lead it is, how complicated it is. Last comment on that, just as an example. We're building this facility in Rochester. It's going to start commissioning end of this year. We placed the orders for some of the key equipment in 2021. So this is solvent extraction equipment, crystallization equipment. We knew that it was super long lead. We knew we had to do that. And that was at the point where we knew what it was. So imagine today you start with engineering and trying to figure out what you need and doing all the piloting and all that work. It's going to take years. So how do we fast track existing projects that are shovel ready, shovel going? That's part of it. But I think we have to do our part to discuss cross industry to help educate and provide teaching to say, hey, these are the challenges and how do we work together to overcome them?
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think, maybe Tina, you might have some insights into this, when you talk about that, the equipment that's required, the skill sets, how do we send the right signals to the market? I think a lot of people look at this as an industry that's going to be down the road. How do we start to address this and really send the right signals that this is coming? Does it have to come from the end users, the OEMs? Are they the real ones with the sway in this equation? Or is it enough that government sort of sets us on the right direction and industry will follow? How do you see that in some of your clients? And maybe what do you see as some of the challenges for that?
I mean, I think there's quite a bit of momentum now from all sides, I think we're seeing. So I think that's there. I think Stacy said these strategic partnerships. I mean, you got to be pragmatic about how to achieve your goal. The biggest challenge we see when we talk about costs escalating is schedule delays. And so you have to understand what your long leads are. You have to understand your permitting requirements, work with your regulatory agencies to sequence all your engineering and your inputs in a timely way. You're not bypassing governance by doing any of this. You're just planning smart upfront, developing partnerships with some of these vendors. And then if those vendors have that sort of forewarning, they know what's coming, they can staff up, they can order their materials. So all of this needs to work together to achieve this. And because that schedule, it's about time to market, it's about getting that revenue. And the longer you delay, it costs you even more money.
And are you already seeing delays on that? We certainly are starting to see, developers that should be coming online in the next 1-2 years that are, to your point about, lead times for machinery are faced with, it's going to be 12 months now, it's 24 months plus. We need reagents, we need, all of these.
So if people wait always, okay, I'm going to wait for everything's buttoned up and approved, and then I'll look at bidding and placing an order, you got to look at that long lead item. You got to look at, okay, can I place an engineering order? Can I do it two-phase? Is there something I can do? Again, you have to take some calculated risks and see how that's going to pan out.
And that's maybe drawing on the analogy from the mining industry. In our background, that would have been very atypical. You would have had a very structured, long process, and sometimes my feeling was on the other side, schedule, maybe depending on the client, wasn't necessarily the main driver, or it was okay, you could afford to go through that and let schedule slip. But now, with having to hit these targets, you have to think outside the box. And that does take a very different execution approach. In parallelizing a whole bunch of things, that's what we've had to do. But we can pull people from that original industry, back to the point of people, that have been there, done that, and know what can go wrong. So we're thinking about it way ahead, mitigating it now, and bringing in the right owners team to help make it happen. So,
yeah, the technical team is key. The reason we are where we are today and not 2 years later is because we did a design build concept. Yeah, that was a calculated risk, but we calculated risk because we brought in a great team that, we had confidence in, that, we put a higher value on first to market versus, what the downside potentially could be. Did we make a few mistakes? Sure, we made a few mistakes, but I still think the first to market is a much larger value than the mistakes that cost us.
Yeah, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but we always joke, you can spend 8 years studying something and spend hundreds of millions of dollars and build it and still get it wrong, and then spend more money to fix it. So are you better to get 80% of the way there, take an intelligent risk and move ahead, and then be able to fix certain things along the way? That's the sort of approach that we have to take in these timelines, but at the same time in a thoughtful way that mitigates risk.
We're still in the middle, you still had COVID, and you have which created supply chain issues. Then you have the inflationary issues as well today. So, we're always going to have obstacles.
So I'd like to shift gears a little bit and go back to one of you mentioned about permitting. And I think permitting some of these facilities is, we're talking about developing new processing facilities, refineries in parts of the world that that haven't hosted them in some cases ever, but certainly for a long amount of time. And in many cases being asked to do it in sort of with much more stringent environmental considerations, with new technologies. How do you think what would be your words of advice to policymakers, and maybe some of your words of wisdom to policymakers about, how do we set up this jurisdiction? How do we make the parts of where each of you are operating, how do we make this happen a bit quicker? How do we make it so that we're not sat here in 5-10 years' time going, you know what, we had a great opportunity, but it sort of passed us by because we couldn't pull the trigger? Well, what lessons can we maybe learn from Saskatchewan? And then I'd love to hear some of the other panelists' thoughts as well.
As a policymaker, I'm actually more anxious to listen to what's suggested by the three folks to my left. I would just say you need to work with industry to provide that certainty. Everyone has a role to play in improving the economics, attracting that capital. I talked about the intelligence and the innovation that we have in the service sector, in our mining sector in Saskatchewan, and the processing sector. That's part of it, and that needs to be a part of the offer. The capital ultimately will come, and the equity markets have a role to play as well. Governments also have a role to play, and I spoke about what the role of our national governments, where they are today with here in the U.S., and likely hear more today from our federal government in Canada. The subnationals have a role to play as well, I think, for better or worse in that certainty in the regulatory environment that's there. And I mentioned we just completed one potash mine. There's another one under construction, the uranium mine coming in, a copper mine, net zero copper mine is the proposal going through the regulatory process in Saskatchewan. There's diamonds, there's lithium, there's all of these things. There aren't very many jurisdictions in North America that has that type of activity in either the regulatory process or the actual construction process of a mining project. We're very proud of that, and I think one of the things that governments can do alongside industry is to better communicate not only what we're doing, but how we're producing these products that we are. Because if we're going to build a North American supply chain with all of the standards that we have in North America, the ESG standards, the labor standards, and then turn around and say, well, it's more expensive than sourcing that product from other areas of the world. Well, what did you think it was going to be? Of course, it's more expensive when you have all of these standards in place. But you do build that energy security, you do build that food security, and I think over time, you become the best in class or best in the world at doing what you're doing. Thus, the food security example I used earlier, we are the best. North American food producers are among the very best in the world. We can emulate that here if we truly focus and everybody brings to the table what they have. What we do, and I'll close where I started, what we do in Saskatchewan is mining and those first few steps of the processing. We try to get a mine through the regulatory process in 6, maybe 7 years so that they can start their construction, and it's working for us. It's working for us. We're communicating how we're doing that to other Canadians and other North Americans here from an ESG perspective. But yes, those products there's a certain cost that comes with those products relative to other areas of the world. We need to understand that if we're going to truly achieve that's food security, energy security, and ultimately the security of our continent into the future.
On permitting, look, I'd flip the script a bit and say it's also on the companies, right? I mean, I'm an engineer, so sometimes when you speak in certain terms, it ends up being laden with jargon, but you need to bring in the right team members that can relate to a community, right? And do that work way up front, right? And so we've been fortunate wherever we are, and it does come back to the technology too. You can't be a net negative. So there's some design choices in what you do, and you have to think about the tech and economics of that, right? What does it stack up at? But engage early and engage often. And I think one of the difficulties of this industry is it's really hard to understand, I think, when you're looking on the outside in. Like, we live it, breathe it every day, and it's easy to forget that. So we have to find ways to communicate what is it, what are we doing, but also how does it fit into the bigger whole on this path to net zero, on this path to decarbonization. I think once you do that, then it's relatable. But there's an onus on the companies at the end of the day from my perspective.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add on permitting, which we did, fortunately, I've been in the environmental industry for more than 30 years, had some really good relationships with the EPA and the rest of the regulators. I love your answer on how you all want to work. We brought in, before we closed on this mine property, we brought in the EPA and the regulators, sat down, treated them as partners, because they are our partner, to figure out what their expectations are, tell them what our plans are, and then we said, how can we work together and accomplish these goals? And you bring them in early, the communication's there, and it only streamlines the permitting process. It's all it can do, and keep constant communications. But in our situation, though, we were a Superfund site. It was a former lead mine. Everybody in the community wanted this site cleaned up. So here we're coming in. We have white hats on because we're cleaning up a Superfund site. It just so happened it was sitting there, and there's a nice resource there for the future that can create more jobs for the community, bring them on board, keep them up to date on what's going on. And when you combine a Superfund site with a mining site that was a former mine, the processing, it ends up becoming a streamlined, robust permitting program.
Anything to add, Tina?
No,
All
just
covered.
reiterate that clear goalposts, transparencies. It's not about circumventing governance, but the more we know what we have to do, the more we can sequence engineering, get the information in a timely way, and deliver.
So we are coming up on time. Maybe just a quick, maybe a slightly more fun question to finish on. In the sense, one thing we've toyed around with the idea of benchmark, and I think you're starting to see inklings of, is sort of your end users of these materials becoming miners, right? Automakers always becoming miners. They're having to go the whole way upstream. We've talked about the importance of strategic collaborations, investments from downstream. Will we be looking back in 5 years' time and seeing a number, maybe not miners, I think miners is, a lot of people would agree, is maybe a bit too far for automakers to sort of stretch, but we've seen the Teslas of the world hint towards, we want to do our own processing. We want to be able to, if you can control that step, then maybe you can open up the amount of feedstock that might be accessible to you. Do you think we'll be looking back in a few years' time and seeing a lot of automakers that are now operating in your fields?
I mean, anything can happen, but I think, I think back to my point on manufacturing versus metallurgy, I think there is a divide there, and I think it's very specific company by company. Tesla has their own, strategy around that. So far my read has been when we interact partner, I think once you start getting into the refined chemical space of this, where you start to have to do metallurgy, get to a specific spec, it is quite different. Not to say that somebody couldn't step in a certain way, but maybe I'll be proved wrong.
Anyone else? Any other thoughts?
I think, no, I don't think that will be how it happens. I just don't think they, in this case, whether it's a battery manufacturer or an auto manufacturer, have the expertise to go right back through the supply chain. I think, as I said, there's areas and people in certain areas of North America and the world that do the mining well, and I don't think that the auto manufacturer quite understands all that goes into that industry. It is a separate industry, however, it is part of the same supply chain. So I don't think that will be the case, but I might be proven wrong as well. I've been proven wrong before.
I don't believe that. Okay, well, maybe that's a nice place to finish. And I loved what was your saying about do what you do well?
Stick to your knitting.
Stick to your knitting. I love that. I haven't heard that, so I'm going to use that one going forward. So we'll stick to our knitting, and hopefully we can push this all in the right direction. But thank you all for joining, and please join me in thanking our panelists.